Why does silence sometimes carry more weight than words? The morning air at Fort Bragg clung to everything, thick, heavy, the kind of humidity that makes your uniform stick to your skin before you've even started the day. Sergeant First Class Kira Dean stepped off that transport bus like she'd done it 1,000 times before, because she had. Her duffel bag hung from one shoulder with an ease that looked effortless, but nothing about her was effortless. Not really. She was 32, though her face could have passed for younger, slender frame. Dark hair pulled back tight, regulation bun, and those eyes, amber, striking, the kind that took everything in but gave nothing away. Most people saw nervousness when they looked at her. They were wrong. What they were seeing was assessment, calculation, the quiet work of someone who'd learned to read a room before anyone knew she was there. The Advanced Infantry Training Unit sprawled before her like a test she hadn't asked for. Aging buildings, obstacle courses worn smooth by decades of boots. This was her new assignment, a dramatic shift from the last 8 years. But no one here would know about those years. That information lived somewhere else, somewhere classified, somewhere only people with the highest clearances could access. And there weren't many of those people. Staff Sergeant Vincent Rort spotted her first, barrel chest straining against his uniform, the swagger of a man who'd spent 5 years molding recruits into something he recognized. He looked her up and down, barely concealed skepticism written all over his face. His thick eyebrows drew together like he'd already made his decision about her. "You Dean?" he asked, though he was already glancing at the roster on his clipboard. "Yes, Staff Sergeant," she replied. Her voice was steady, soft, almost musical in its quietness. Rort's expression soured. He'd been expecting someone different, someone who looked like they'd seen combat, someone with hard edges, visible scars, the things he associated with real soldiers. This woman before him seemed too delicate, too composed, too quiet. "Welcome to AITU," he said without warmth. "We run a tight ship here. I hope you're ready to actually work for a living instead of whatever desk job you've been warming." Kira simply nodded. No defense, no explanation. She'd learned long ago that some truths were better left unspoken, especially when they were wrapped in classifications that could end careers if violated. The barracks she was assigned to housed 6 other instructors, all male, all veterans of various conflicts, all seemingly cut from the same cloth of loud confidence and competitive bravado. Master Sergeant Tyrell Voss was the first to greet her as she set her gear on the empty bunk near the door. "Fresh meat," Voss announced to the room, his voice bouncing off concrete walls. "What did you do to get stuck here, sweetheart? Fail out of admin school?" The others laughed, a chorus of masculine amusement that filled the space like smoke. Kira methodically began unpacking, movements efficient, practiced, giving no indication that the comment had landed. "She's awful quiet," observed Sergeant First Class Ramon Oakes from his bunk across the room. He was cleaning his rifle with exaggerated care, muscular arms working the cloth along the barrel. "Cat got your tongue, Dean." "Just focusing on getting settled," she replied evenly, not looking up from her task. The truth was that Kira had spent the better part of the last 8 years in places these men had only heard about in classified briefings. She'd operated in the shadows of 3 different countries, her presence so compartmentalized that even her own chain of command had been fragmented by need-to-know restrictions. Her quiet nature wasn't a weakness. It was a survival skill, honed in environments where a single wrong word could compromise an entire operation. Lieutenant Brennan Cross entered the barracks then, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was young for his rank, barely 30, the kind of polished appearance that suggested a career built more on connections than combat experience. His eyes swept the room and landed on Kira with obvious disappointment. "Sergeant Dean," he said, his tone formal but cold. "I reviewed your file. Looks like you've been with support units mostly. This is a combat training facility. We need instructors who have actually been in the fight, not behind a desk. I trust you'll be able to keep up." Kira met his gaze directly, those amber eyes steady and unreadable. "I'll do my job, sir," she said simply. Cross seemed annoyed by her lack of elaboration, by her refusal to justify herself or explain. He wanted a reaction, some sign of defensiveness or eagerness to prove herself. Instead, he got only calm acceptance. "See that you do," he said curtly before leaving the barracks. As the door closed behind him, Voss let out a low whistle. "Ice cold, that one," he said, gesturing toward Kira with his thumb. "But she probably hasn't fired a rifle in anger once in her career." The assumptions settled over the room like dust, unchallenged, accepted as fact. Kira continued unpacking, hands steady, expression unchanged. She'd heard worse, endured worse, survived worse. These words were nothing compared to the weight of the secrets she carried. But there was something none of them knew, something that would change everything, and it was coming, sooner than anyone expected. What happens when you're given a job you could do with your eyes closed, but no one trusts you to do it at all? The first week at the Advanced Infantry Training Unit passed in a blur of skepticism and barely concealed contempt. Kira found herself assigned to the most basic training modules, teaching new recruits how to properly clean their weapons and maintain their gear. It was work that any private could have done, and the message was clear. Lieutenant Cross didn't trust her with anything more substantial. During morning formation on her 6th day, Staff Sergeant Rort announced the training schedule with his usual bombastic energy. His voice carried across the assembled instructors and recruits like a bullhorn. "Today we're running live fire exercises on Range 7, he barked. "Dean, you'll be on safety duty. Stand behind the line and make sure nobody does anything stupid." Several of the male instructors exchanged knowing glances. Safety duty was the assignment given to instructors who weren't trusted to actually teach marksmanship. It was glorified babysitting. Kira nodded once, face betraying nothing. She'd qualified expert marksman on every weapon system the Army had offered her, including several that didn't officially exist in any public records. She'd made shots at distances and under conditions that would have seemed impossible to most of the men standing around her. But none of that mattered here, not when her actual service record was locked behind classifications she couldn't discuss. At the range, Private Elias Crane struggled with his rifle, hands shaking as he tried to acquire his target. He was 19, fresh out of basic training and visibly anxious. After his third shot went wide, missing the target entirely, he slumped in frustration. "I can't do this," he muttered loud enough for those nearby to hear. Sergeant First Class Oakes, who was supposed to be instructing the group, was too busy talking with another instructor about weekend plans. He'd barely glanced at the recruits since they'd begun firing. Kira moved quietly to Crane's position, crouched beside him. Her voice was low, meant only for him. "Your breathing is off," she said simply. "You're anticipating the recoil. Exhale slowly, squeeze between heartbeats, don't pull." Crane looked at her with surprise, then skepticism. "You've done this before?" he asked, doubt evident in his tone. "A few times," she replied, the understatement so massive it was almost absurd. He followed her advice, adjusted his stance as she made minute corrections to his grip. His next shot hit center mass on the target, then the next, then the next. 5 rounds, 5 hits. Crane looked at her with wide eyes, something like wonder breaking through his earlier frustration. "How did you?" "Practice," Kira said, standing. "And breathing, always the breathing." She moved away before he could ask more questions, but the damage was done. Several other recruits had noticed. Word spread the way it always does among soldiers. By evening formation, half the training company knew that the quiet female instructor on safety duty had just coached a struggling private into a perfect grouping. That night in the barracks, Sergeant First Class Oakes brought it up over a card game. "Heard you helped Crane with his shooting today," he said, not looking up from his cards. Kid couldn't hit the broad side of a barn before you showed up. He just needed to relax, Kira said from her bunk, not looking up from her book. Funny thing, though, Oakes continued. The way Crane described your instruction, it sounded pretty advanced, like you actually know your way around a rifle. I know enough, Kira said. Enough for what? Master Sergeant Voss interjected. Enough to pass basic qualification, or enough to actually put rounds on target under pressure. Kira closed her book, met his gaze. Enough to do my job, Master Sergeant. It wasn't an answer, but it was all she was going to give. The frustration in the room was palpable. These men were used to soldiers who talked big, who shared war stories, who competed over who'd seen more action. Kira's silence felt like a challenge, like she was holding something back, and she was holding back everything. The truth sat in her chest like a stone, heavy, constant. She'd spent 8 years as a long-range reconnaissance specialist in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. She'd operated alone for months at a time, gathering intelligence, taking shots that needed to be perfect because there was no backup, no second chance, no room for error. She'd seen things that would haunt her for the rest of her life, done things that kept her awake some nights, and she couldn't talk about any of it. Not because she didn't want to, but because the missions were still classified, the operations still active, the methods still in use. Talking about them would put other soldiers at risk, would compromise ongoing work, would violate every oath she'd ever taken. So she stayed quiet, let them think what they wanted, let them assume she was soft, inexperienced, a desk jockey who'd somehow ended up in a combat training unit. It was easier that way, safer for everyone. But part of her, the part that had earned every scar and every sleepless night, wanted them to know, wanted to see their faces when they realized who she really was, what she'd really done. And that moment was coming, whether she wanted it or not. Have you ever watched someone prove themselves without saying a single word? The shooting range incident with Private Crane was just the beginning. Over the next few days, small moments began to accumulate, tiny cracks in the facade that Kira had built around herself, each one insignificant on its own, but together they formed a pattern that the other instructors couldn't quite ignore. During a tactical movement drill, one of the recruits stumbled through a room clearing exercise, his movements awkward and uncertain. Lieutenant Cross watched with growing frustration, finally stepping in to demonstrate the proper technique himself. His execution was textbook, clean, but also rigid, the kind of movement that worked on a training range but would get you killed in an actual hostile environment. Kira stood at the back of the group saying nothing, but her eyes tracked every movement, every mistake, every vulnerability in Cross's approach. When the demonstration ended and Cross dismissed the recruits for a break, Private Crane approached her quietly. "Sergeant Dean," he said, his voice low, "can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." That entry technique Lieutenant Cross just showed us, it felt wrong somehow, like I'd be exposed for too long in the doorway. Am I crazy? Kira glanced around, made sure no one else was listening. "You're not crazy," she said quietly. "The technique works in controlled environments, but in actual combat, you'd want to use a quick peek method first. Never silhouette yourself in a fatal funnel unless you have no choice." Crane's eyes widened. "That's what I thought, but how do you?" "Just an observation," Kira said, cutting him off gently. "Stick to what Lieutenant Cross teaches you for now. It'll get you through the training." But the conversation had been overheard. Staff Sergeant Rort had been standing just close enough to catch the tail end of it. That evening, he pulled Kira aside after formation. "You got a problem with Lieutenant Cross's instruction?" he asked, his tone confrontational. "No, Staff Sergeant." "Then why are you contradicting his teaching?" "I wasn't contradicting. I was answering a private's question. About tactical movement, about room clearing, about combat techniques." Rort's eyes narrowed. "Where exactly did a support unit sergeant learn about fatal funnels and quick peek entries?" Kira held his gaze. I read Staff Sergeant manuals, after-action reports. I try to stay current. Reading about something and knowing it are two different things, Dean. Yes, Staff Sergeant, they are. Rort wanted to push further. She could see it in his face, but he had no grounds. She hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't violated any regulations, hadn't challenged anyone's authority. She just answered a question, so he let it go. But the seed of doubt was planted. That night, Kira lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. The mask was getting harder to maintain. Every instinct she had fought against the substandard training she was witnessing. Every fiber of her being wanted to step in, to correct, to teach properly, because lives depended on it. Someday, these recruits would be in actual combat, and if they were taught wrong, they'd die wrong. But she couldn't, not yet, not without authorization, not without clearance to reveal her actual background. So she watched, waited, and felt the weight of silence grow heavier every day. During the morning run on her 10th day at the unit, something unexpected happened. The formation was moving along the usual route when one of the recruits, a young woman named Private Jessica Mora, suddenly collapsed. She hit the ground hard, convulsing, foam at her lips, eyes rolling back. The formation ground to a halt, confusion spreading through the ranks like wildfire. Staff Sergeant Rort pushed his way to the front, his face going pale when he saw Mora's condition. "Someone call the medics," he shouted, his voice tight with panic. But Kira was already moving. She dropped to her knees beside Mora, her hands moving with practiced precision. She turned Mora onto her side, clearing her airway, checked her pulse, her breathing, her pupils. "She's seizing," Kira said, her voice calm, controlled. "Looks like a grand mal. We need to time it and protect her from injury. Don't restrain her, just keep her safe." Rort stared at her. "How do you know?" "Staff Sergeant, I need something soft for under her head. Now." Someone handed her a rolled-up jacket. Kira positioned it carefully, then began timing the seizure on her watch. Her movements were efficient, confident. The movements of someone who'd done this before, multiple times, under pressure. The seizure lasted 90 seconds. When it ended, Mora went limp, her breathing ragged but steady. Kira maintained her position, monitoring vitals, speaking quietly to Mora even though the private was barely conscious. "You're okay, you're safe, just breathe. The medics are coming." When the ambulance arrived 3 minutes later, Kira gave the EMTs a precise rundown. Duration of seizure, vital signs, observable symptoms, medical history she'd remembered from Mora's file. The EMTs looked at her with surprise and respect, recognizing the quality of her assessment. As they loaded Mora into the ambulance, one of the EMTs turned to Kira. "You got combat medic training." "Something like that," Kira replied. After the ambulance left, the formation stood in stunned silence. Staff Sergeant Rort looked at Kira with an expression she couldn't quite read. Confusion, suspicion, and maybe, just maybe, the first hint of respect. "Dismissed," he said quietly. "Get back to barracks." As the formation broke up, Kira walked back alone. She could feel eyes on her, questions forming, the mask was slipping, and she wasn't sure if she cared anymore. Maybe it was time, maybe the truth needed to come out, but on whose terms, hers or theirs? She didn't know yet, but she could feel the moment approaching, like a storm on the horizon, inevitable, unstoppable, coming whether she was ready or not. When does the weight of what you've carried finally become too heavy to hide? The incident with Private Mora changed something fundamental. The other instructors didn't know what to make of Kira anymore. The pieces didn't fit. Support unit background, but combat medicine expertise. Quiet demeanor, but decisive action under pressure. They'd built a picture of who they thought she was, and now that picture was cracking, falling apart, revealing something underneath they didn't understand. Sergeant First Class Oakes found himself watching her more carefully, the way she moved with economy of motion, the way her eyes constantly scanned her environment. the way she positioned herself in any room to maintain maximum situational awareness. These weren't learned behaviors. They were ingrained, automatic, the kind of habits that only came from prolonged exposure to dangerous environments. During a classroom session on combat medicine, Kira sat in the back row as usual, taking notes while Staff Sergeant Rort lectured on basic trauma care. His instruction was adequate but outdated, focused on techniques that had been standard a decade earlier but had since been refined by lessons learned in actual combat zones. Kira remained silent, pen moving across her notebook, until Rort made a statement about tourniquet application that was dangerously incorrect. "Staff Sergeant," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise. "That technique was revised in the current combat casualty care guidelines. The high and tight application you described can cause unnecessary tissue damage. Current protocol recommends 2 to 3 inches above the wound." The room went silent. Rort turned slowly, his face flushing. "And where exactly did you learn about current combat casualty care protocols, Dean? From a PowerPoint presentation?" "From applying 17 tourniquets in actual combat situations," Kira replied evenly. 12 of those casualties survived to full recovery. The technique matters." The specificity of her response landed like a physical blow. 17 tourniquets meant 17 serious injuries witnessed. 17 moments of life-threatening trauma managed under fire. It was a number that told a story of sustained combat exposure that contradicted everything the instructors believed about her. Rort recovered quickly, his ego wounded but his position as instructor forcing him to maintain authority. "We will follow the approved training manual, Sergeant Dean. If you have concerns about curriculum, take them up through proper channels." "Yes, Staff Sergeant," Kira said, returning to her notes without further comment. But several of the recruits were looking at her differently now, adding this moment to the growing collection of inconsistencies between who she was supposed to be and who she might actually be. That afternoon, during hand-to-hand combat training, Master Sergeant Voss was demonstrating defensive techniques against knife attacks. His instruction was competent but theoretical, the kind of teaching done by someone who trained extensively but never actually faced a blade in genuine combat. He called for a volunteer to serve as the attacker for his demonstration. "Dean," he called out, a slight smirk on his face, "come up here and try to stab me. Let's see if you can manage that." It was meant to be humiliating, a way to put her in a subordinate position while he demonstrated his superior skills. Kira stood and moved to the front of the group, accepting the rubber training knife that Voss handed her. The recruits watched with interest, sensing tension but not understanding its source. "Come at me like you mean it," Voss instructed, settling into his fighting stance. "Don't hold back just because you're worried about hurting me." Kira's expression didn't change. She simply moved. What happened next occurred so quickly that most of the watching recruits couldn't fully process it. She fainted high, drawing Voss's defensive reaction, then dropped low and swept his legs while simultaneously redirecting his balance with a hand against his shoulder. Voss hit the ground hard, the air leaving his lungs in a rush. And before he could react, Kira had the training knife pressed against his carotid artery with her knee on his chest. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds. She held the position for a moment, then stood smoothly and offered Voss her hand to help him up. He took it automatically, too shocked to refuse, and rose to his feet with his face burning red with embarrassment and anger. "Lucky shot," he muttered, trying to salvage his dignity. "Let's try that again." They went again. The result was identical, though Kira used a different technique. And again. And again. 4 times Voss ended up on the ground with a training knife at his throat, and each time the movement was so controlled and precise that it became impossible to dismiss as luck. The recruits watched in stunned silence as their seemingly invincible instructor, was systematically dismantled by the quiet woman they'd all dismissed. Voss finally held up his hand, breathing hard, his ego thoroughly bruised. "All right, that's enough demonstration for today," he said curtly. "Clearly Sergeant Dean has some hand-to-hand experience. Break into pairs and practice the basic techniques I showed you earlier." As the recruits dispersed, Voss pulled Kira aside, his voice low and tight. "Where did you learn to fight like that? That wasn't basic combatives training." "Here and there," Kira replied, offering nothing more. "That's not an answer," Voss pressed. "You just humiliated me in front of my students. I deserve to know who I'm dealing with." Kira met his gaze steadily. "With respect, Master Sergeant, you asked me to attack you like I meant it. I did what you requested. If that was humiliating, perhaps the lesson is to be more careful about what you request." She walked away before he could respond, leaving Voss standing alone with questions multiplying in his mind. That evening in the barracks, the conversation inevitably turned to the growing mystery of Sergeant First Class Kira Dean. "Something doesn't add up," Oak said, sitting on his bunk and cleaning his pistol with methodical attention. "The ordnance knowledge, the combat medicine specifics, those hand-to-hand skills, that's not the profile of someone who spent their career in support units." "Maybe her file is incomplete," suggested another instructor, a younger sergeant named Felipe Torres. "Maybe there's more to her record that we don't have access to." "Or maybe she's exaggerating," Voss countered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Anyone can get lucky in a training scenario. Real combat is different." But even as he said it, he remembered the controlled precision of her movements. The way she'd read and countered his defenses with the kind of expertise that only came from extensive training and actual application. That wasn't luck. That was skill honed through repetition and pressure. Kira lay on her bunk on the far side of the barracks, reading her paperback novel and listening to their speculation with detached interest. She knew what was happening. The mask was slipping, not because she wanted it to, but because maintaining it while also doing her job was becoming impossible. Every time she corrected unsafe practices or demonstrated actual competence, she revealed another piece of the truth that her classified service record concealed. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Colonel Ashford, scheduled to arrive for his inspection in less than a week. The message was brief. "Looking forward to seeing how the unit is functioning. I suspect there will be some interesting discoveries." Kira smiled slightly at the understatement. Ashford had access to her full file, knew exactly what was about to unfold, and was clearly looking forward to the revelation. She typed a simple response. "Yes, sir, it should be educational." The truth was coming, one way or another, and part of her felt relief. The weight of silence was finally becoming too heavy to carry alone. What does it take for people to see what's been in front of them all along? The week before Colonel Ashford's inspection passed in a strange tension. The other instructors circled around Kira like she was a puzzle they couldn't solve. They didn't trust her, but they also couldn't dismiss her anymore. Not after what they'd seen, not after the questions had started piling up. Lieutenant Cross called a meeting of all instructors on Wednesday evening. His office was cramped, barely large enough for 7 people to stand comfortably. He sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, expression serious. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "There are rumors circulating among the recruits, questions about Sergeant Dean's qualifications, her background, whether she's who she says she is." All eyes turned to Kira. She stood against the back wall, arms crossed, expression neutral. "With respect, sir," she said quietly, "I've never claimed to be anything other than what my official file says." "That's exactly the problem," Cross shot back. "Your official file says support units, administrative work, but your demonstrated skill set tells a very different story. So which is it, Sergeant? Are you lying about what you can do, or is your file lying about what you've done?" It was a trap, A clever one. Either answer would force her to reveal information she wasn't authorized to disclose. Kira met his gaze steadily. My file contains everything I'm authorized to share, sir. If there are discrepancies between what it says and what you've observed, I suggest you take that up with whoever has access to the classified portions. Cross's jaw tightened. Are you telling me parts of your file are above my clearance level? I'm telling you that I've answered every question I'm authorized to answer, sir. Everything else exists in channels I don't control. The room fell silent. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Classified service record, compartmentalized information, operations that couldn't be discussed. It was the first time Kira had come close to admitting that her background was more complex than anyone had assumed. Staff Sergeant Rort spoke up. Colonel Ashford arrives in 4 days. Maybe he can shed some light on this situation. Maybe, Cross said, though he didn't sound convinced. Until then, Sergeant Dean, you're restricted to basic training duties only. No more demonstrations. No more tactical instruction. No more medical interventions. Clear. Crystal, sir. Dismissed. As the instructors filed out, Kira felt the weight of their stares. Suspicion, curiosity, resentment. She'd become a problem they didn't know how to solve, and in 4 days everything would change. That night, Private Crane found Kira outside the barracks, smoking a cigarette under the dim light of a security lamp. She didn't smoke often, but some nights the weight needed somewhere to go. Sergeant Dean, Crane said hesitantly, can I talk to you? You're already talking, Private. It's just, I wanted to say thank you for helping me with the rifle, for not making me feel stupid. Kira took a drag, exhaled slowly. You're not stupid, Crane, you were just nervous. Happens to everyone. The other instructors, they don't teach like you. They show us what to do, but they don't explain why. You do. You make it make sense. Experience teaches you that the why matters as much as the how. How much experience do you have, really? Kira looked at him, young face, earnest eyes, genuine curiosity without malice. She felt something crack inside her chest. More than I wish I did, Private. More than anyone should have to carry. Crane nodded slowly. I believe you. I don't know what you did before this, but I know you're the real thing. The others, they're good soldiers, but you've been somewhere they haven't, done things they can't imagine. Careful, Crane. Speculation like that can get you in trouble. Is it speculation, though? Kira flicked her cigarette away, watched the ember die in the dirt. In 4 days, you'll get your answers. Until then, focus on your training. Learn everything they're teaching you, even the wrong things, because knowing what not to do is sometimes as important as knowing what to do. Yes, Sergeant. As Crane walked away, Kira stood alone in the darkness and felt the countdown ticking in her chest. 4 days, 96 hours, and then the truth would finally come out. She'd spent 8 years in the shadows. 8 years carrying secrets that weighed more than any gear she'd ever humped. 8 years being someone she wasn't, doing things she couldn't talk about, surviving situations that existed only in classified reports. And soon all of it would be laid bare. The quiet warrior would be forced into the light, and she didn't know if she was ready for that, didn't know if she'd ever be ready. But ready or not, it was coming. Can the truth really set you free, or does it just change the weight you carry? The morning of Colonel Ashford's arrival dawned clear and cold. The entire unit assembled in formation at 600 hours, uniforms pressed to perfection, boots polished until they gleamed. Lieutenant Cross stood at the front, his posture rigid with the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing your performance is about to be evaluated by someone who actually matters. Kira stood in the back row of instructors, her expression calm. She'd slept better last night than she had in weeks. The waiting was almost over, the anticipation worse than the reveal would be. At least, that's what she told herself. The convoy arrived precisely on time. 3 vehicles, security detail, and Colonel Marcus Ashford, a man who'd spent 30 years in special operations and didn't suffer fools. He stepped out of the middle vehicle with the kind of presence that made everyone stand a little straighter. Silver hair, hard eyes, the weathered face of someone who'd seen combat on 4 continents. Lieutenant Cross saluted sharply. "Sir, welcome to Advanced Infantry Training Unit. We're honored to have you." "At ease, Lieutenant," Ashford said, returning the salute. His eyes swept across the formation, taking in every detail. When his gaze landed on Kira, something flickered in his expression. Recognition, satisfaction. "Let's begin the inspection." The morning passed in the usual routine. Ashford reviewed training schedules, observed classroom instruction, walked through the barracks with a critical eye. He asked pointed questions, identified weaknesses, noted areas for improvement. Cross scrambled to justify every decision, every choice, every aspect of the unit's operation. At 1100 hours, Ashford called for a break. "I'd like to speak with each instructor individually," he announced. 15 minutes each. Alphabetically. Sergeant Dean, you're first." The surprise rippled through the gathered instructors. Alphabetically would put Dean at the beginning, but Ashford's tone suggested this wasn't random. This was intentional. Kira followed the colonel to a small office, closing the door behind them. Ashford gestured to a chair. "Sit, Sergeant." She sat. He settled into the chair across from her, his expression unreadable. "How have they been treating you?" he asked. "As expected, sir, given what they have access to." "Which is almost nothing," Ashford said. "By design. Your file shows support units, administrative positions, the kind of background that doesn't raise eyebrows. Meanwhile, the real file, the one that shows 8 years of reconnaissance operations in denied territory, sits in a vault that maybe 12 people in the entire military can access." Kira said nothing, just waited. "I'm here to change that," Ashford continued. "The operation you were part of, the work you did, it's being declassified, partially, enough to explain your actual background, enough to give these instructors context for who you really are." Something tightened in Kira's chest. "Sir, with respect, I didn't ask for this." "I know you didn't, but you've been here 3 weeks and you're already making waves. The lieutenant thinks you're a problem. The other instructors think you're a fraud. And the recruits think you're the best instructor on this entire base. All because you can't help being who you are. Can't help knowing what you know." "I've been careful, sir." "You have, but careful only goes so far when your skill set is this far beyond your cover story. So we're going to end the charade, today, in front of everyone." Kira felt her stomach drop. "How?" Ashford smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. "Formation at 1400 hours. Full unit assembly. I'm going to read certain portions of your actual service record, the parts that are now declassified, and then we're going to have a very educational conversation about assumptions and reality. Sir, this will destroy any credibility I might have built with them. They'll think I was playing games, deceiving them." "You were deceiving them under orders, following protocol, maintaining operational security. They'll understand that once they know what you actually did, what you sacrificed, what you survived. And if they don't, then they're not the instructors I thought they were, and they have no business training the next generation of soldiers." The conversation ended. Kira returned to the formation, feeling the eyes of every instructor on her, wondering what had been said, what had been revealed. She gave them nothing, just stood at attention and waited for 1400 hours to arrive. When it did, the entire unit assembled, instructors, recruits, support staff, everyone. Colonel Ashford stood at the front with a folder in his hands, the kind of folder that had classification stamps on every page. "I'm here today to address a situation that has developed within this unit," Ashford began, his voice carrying across the assembled formation. "Specifically, Questions about the qualifications and background of Sergeant First Class Kira Dean. The silence was absolute. Every eye turned to Kira. She stood at attention, face neutral, giving nothing away. Lieutenant Cross has expressed concerns that Sergeant Dean's demonstrated skills exceed what her official file would suggest. He's right. They do. Significantly. But not because she's misrepresented herself. Because her actual service record has been classified at levels above this unit's access. Cross's face paled slightly. The other instructors shifted uncomfortably. I'm here to partially declassify that record, Ashford continued, to give you context for who Sergeant Dean actually is and what she's actually done. He opened the folder, began reading. Sergeant First Class Kira Dean, 8 years, 7 months, 16 days of continuous deployment in support of special reconnaissance operations across 3 denied territories, 147 solo missions conducted behind enemy lines, 73 high-value targets eliminated at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, 17 combat medicine interventions resulting in 12 full recoveries, fluent in 4 languages. Expert qualification in 12 weapon systems, including 3 that remain classified: Purple Heart, Bronze Star with Valor, Silver Star, and a classified commendation that I cannot name, but that is one of the highest honors our nation can bestow. The formation stood in stunned silence, jaws slack, eyes wide, trying to reconcile the quiet woman they dismissed with the warrior Ashford was describing. Sergeant Dean has spent the last 8 years operating in the kind of environments that most of you can't imagine, Ashford said, his voice hard now. She's done things that will never be fully acknowledged, sacrificed parts of herself that can never be recovered, and she's done it all in silence because that's what the mission required. He closed the folder, looked directly at Lieutenant Cross. So when you questioned her qualifications, Lieutenant, you weren't wrong to notice the discrepancy. You were wrong to assume it meant she was inadequate. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's strength beyond measure. Cross looked like he'd been physically struck. The other instructors stood frozen, processing the revelation. Ashford turned to the formation. Sergeant Dean will now assume her proper role as senior combat instructor. She will redesign your tactical curriculum. She will train your instructors, and she will prepare these recruits for the reality of combat as someone who has lived that reality in ways most of us never will. Is that clear? Yes, sir, the formation responded in unison. Dismissed. As the formation broke, Kira stood alone, feeling the weight shift. Not lighter, just different. The secret was out. The mask was off. And now she had to figure out how to be herself in the light after so many years in the shadows. Colonel Ashford approached her as the crowd dispersed. How do you feel, Sergeant? Kira took a breath, let it out slowly. Exposed, sir, vulnerable, like I've lost something I didn't know I needed. You've lost the anonymity, the protection of being underestimated, but you've gained something too, the ability to actually do your job, to train these soldiers properly, to save lives by sharing what you know instead of hiding it. Yes, sir. The truth doesn't make things easier, Sergeant, but it does make them honest. And in our line of work, honesty is sometimes the only thing that keeps us human. He walked away, leaving Kira standing alone in the center of the compound. Around her, she could feel the shift in perception. The recruits looking at her with something like awe. The instructors looking at her with something between respect and shame. Lieutenant Cross standing at a distance, his expression unreadable but his posture deflated. Private Crane approached cautiously. Sergeant Dean, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry we didn't know, sorry we treated you like someone who hadn't earned their place, Kira finished for him. You treated me based on the information you had. That's not wrong, Private. That's human. The lesson isn't to feel bad about it. The lesson is to remember that everyone you meet is carrying something you can't see, some weight you don't understand, and maybe, just maybe, to give people the benefit of the doubt before you decide who they are. Crane nodded slowly. Yes, Sergeant, I'll remember that. As he walked away, Kira felt something settle in her chest. The weight wasn't gone. It would never be gone. 8 years of classified operations, of life-and-death decisions, of things done in the dark that would never see the light. That weight was permanent, but maybe it didn't have to be carried alone anymore. Maybe dignity didn't require silence. Maybe strength could exist in both the shadows and the light. She walked back toward the barracks, feeling eyes on her with every step. The quiet warrior was quiet no longer, and the truth, heavy as it was, felt like freedom, or at least a different kind of weight, one she could finally carry in the open. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts, but when it does speak, when it finally tells its truth, the world stops and listens, and everyone remembers that strength comes in forms we don't expect, from people we underestimated, in moments we almost missed. The real heroes rarely announce themselves. They simply show up, do the work, carry the weight, and wait for the moment when the truth can finally be told.